Hello everyone, my name is Christian LaRue from Animate, and today I'm going to be teaching you guys how to make a simple Rubik's Cube in Blender. So let's get started. Okay, so the first step, and I might be shocking a few people, is not deleting the little cube here. Usually every single tutorial starts, delete this cube, delete this lamp, but we'll actually keep these for now. Why? Well, if you've ever looked at a Rubik's Cube, and I'm assuming that everyone following this tutorial has, it's comprised of these smaller cubes, and so we're going to start off by modeling those and then using an array modifier, to essentially create the Rubik's Cube. So I'm going to hit 1 on my numpad to go to the front view. And essentially what we're going to be doing is, like I said, creating those smaller little cubes, and they have kind of like a beveled edge. And so we're going to be creating that by using some loop cuts. So one thing I want you guys to take a note on is this grid in the background. Now, you might not be able to see it too well in the video, but you can use this as a guide for your loop cuts. So I'm going to make 2 loop cuts by hitting Control R, and we need to make them in both directions. And so I'm using my scroll wheel to select 2 loop cuts. For those of you unfamiliar with the loop cut function, you can make as many as you want, but we only need 2. And now I get to choose where I place the cuts. I'm just going to right click to center it. Now I'm going to hit the S key to scale and limit the selection, or limit the scaling to the X axis. As you can see, I can kind of manipulate where the loop cuts are, and based on the grid, I'm counting 2 squares roughly from the edge, so like a 2 square margin, and that's pretty much where I want to rest my cuts. So same thing, restricted to the Z-axis, and same thing at the second square. I don't know if I can give a better visual representation, but you can see this these thicker lines on the grid, and essentially 2 squares, that's the margin I'm giving myself. Okay, so that's good for the front view. Now moving on to the side view, you can hit 3 on the numpad, and we're going to do exactly the same thing once again, except this time we're going to be scaling along the y-axis. So after you hit scale, S, hit Y to restrict it to the y-axis. You can deselect your points by hitting A. That's something I forgot to mention. Okay, so this is what it should look like thus far. Very, very simple stuff. You go to object mode and hit the smooth shading, and then you go modifier, add modifier, and subdivision surface. So already we have a large portion of this done. I'll hit I'll make the view 2 to make 2 subdivisions. You can take it a step further and increase the amount of subdivisions, but honestly, it doesn't really give you anything extra. Yes, it might give you, a nicer, smoother, crisper bevel. But, well, 2 rules of thumb. 1, because this is going to be shrunken down, because the Rubik's Cube is going to be like 27 of these small cubes, any kind of detailing won't really be noticed past a certain point. But as well, to help with the rendering, you want to have the minimum amount of faces that you need. So, like, yeah, if you don't need, 300 faces per cube, then don't use that amount. So 2 is perfectly fine. I'm going to apply this modifier, and then I'm going to scale this down just a bit. Actually, you know what? I'll scale it in just a sec. I'll explain why in a bit. Okay, so now we're going to add another modifier, and we're going to be using the array modifier. If you don't know what this does, well, essentially the visual kind of explains it a bit. It kind of stacks, it makes copies, duplicates, and it stacks them one against another. So you can choose which direction. So right now it's set to make a duplicate right next to the original, essentially 1 unit in the X direction. I'm going to increase that count to 3. And I'm going to increase the number here to 1.02. Now, you might be wondering why. Well, if you look at a Rubik's Cube, each cube needs like some small gaps, some room for maneuverability. because, I mean, you're twisting the thing. So the small gap is essentially that little spacing between cubes. So that looks good. I'm going to apply this, and I'm going to add another array modifier, except instead of putting a value in the x-axis, I'm going to put one in the y-axis. So I'm going to use the exact same number. This is going to keep things symmetrical, and remember to put the count to 3. Okay, so we got one layer of our Rubik's Cube, and you may have already guessed what we're going to do again. Another array modifier, but now in the z-axis. And increase the count to 2, and there we go. We basically have our Rubik's Cube all fleshed out. Now, the next thing we're going to want to do is move the geometry over to the center point, because our original cube was created around the center point, but because we use the array modifier, the whole cube is no longer centered. So if you hit Control-Shift-Alt-C, you have a bunch of these options for the set origin option ability. I don't know what to call this, but anyways, just select geometry to origin, and that will center the entire thing. Now, if I go into my camera, I can scale this down and kind of, determine how big the Rubik's Cube should be. I think that that is pretty good. Okay. So the next thing we're going to create before anything else is our backdrop. And this is a really, really simple backdrop that you can use pretty much for any project. So I'm going to go into Add Mesh Plane, and I'll hit S to scale it up. Okay. Then I'll go into Edit Mode, grab the Edge Selection option, and grab this edge, and then hit E to extrude and limit it to the Z-axis by hitting Z. And that looks about good. Now I'll go back into Object Mode, Add Modifier, Subdivision Surface, and I'll make it to 3. So you got this nice little curved edge. You go back into Object Mode, select these edges right here, with the exception of this middle one right here, and I'll explain in just a sec. If you hit N, you get this little these properties on the side, and if you increase the mean crease with these edges selected, essentially what it does is it makes these sharp. And because we omitted the this middle edge right here, it still retains this nice curve in the middle. Now, the last thing we're going to want to do is create some more edge cuts, or loop cuts. So hit Control-R again, left click to confirm one loop cut, and I'll place it around here, and I'll make another loop cut, whoops, down here. So essentially we have a flat back wall, a flat floor, but we got this nice curve, and essentially as soon as we render this out, this is going to allow the back wall and the floor to kind of smoothly transition into one another without a hard edge. And you could put the you could set the shading to smooth to smooth that out even more. And now I'm going to essentially bring this down just under the cube. If you want, you can have the cube floating, so I'll leave a little gap between the floor and the cube, which is pretty much what I'm going to be doing. And the last thing I'm going to do, hit 1 again to go into front view, and I'm going to scale this in the X direction, so S to scale and X to limit it to the X-axis. And I want to kind of create a 16:9 ratio. Why? Because we want the backdrop to encompass the entire area of the camera. And finally, I'll rotate this along the Z-axis, so R to rotate, Z along the Z-axis, and I'll make it 45 degrees. Okay. And I see that I haven't made this big enough, so I'll scale it up just by hitting S. That should be good. And I'll fix my camera. I don't know why the default location of the camera is like really weird. I don't know. I think it's just someone chose a random point and made that the default, but I'll change this to, let's say 6.5, negative 6.5. Sorry if I'm burping in the background. I just had lunch, which might not have been the smartest thing to do. But yeah, you want to have the x value be the exact same as the y value, with the exception of the negative here, just because we're going to try to keep this as symmetrical as possible. The z, we can fix that later. The x rotation, I guess we'll round these numbers out. So 60, 0, I don't know why it was 0.62 degrees. Again, like the default camera settings are a little weird. And let's make this 45. Okay, so as we can see, the cube is very symmetrical, or the camera is everything symmetrical. And I'm just going to play around with the Z value until everything looks perfect the way that I want. Okay, so far, so good. The only thing we'll need to adjust later in just a second is the lighting, but everything seems great thus far. Okay, so we're going to apply our first material, and we can call this plastic. So the way we're going to tackle creating the materials for this is we're going to create the base plastic that will be applied to all the cubes, and then we'll select faces on the side of each cube and then assign new materials to those, which will be the colors, kind of like the stickers. So if you hear me referring to something as stickers, I'm talking about that. The faces will be selecting on the sides. So, oh, and really important, I mean, you could do this in Blender Render, but Cycles is a lot better for the simple reason that the shadows and the lights are a lot softer. I like it a heck of a lot better. I think once you get used to using Cycles Render, then you'll stick with it forever. Okay, so I'm going to use nodes, and what we're going to want to do is select Mix Shader, because we're going to want to mix a diffuse shader and a glossy shader. So the first shader I'm going to use is a diffuse shader, and the second shader is going to be a glossy shader. Now, those familiar with the node editor might be might be asking why I'm not using that. I guess for two reasons. One, because this tutorial is so simple that I don't really even need to go into the node editor. But the second reason is, I mean, this tutorial is kind of aimed at people who have a bit of experience but are still learning. And so the node editor might be a little too daunting for them. You can do this all in here. So, okay, so the color for the diffuse, I'll set it to black. And the factor of the mix shader, I'll set it to 0.2. And so if we go down here into rendered mode, you could see right here we have this really, really dark material with a bit of gloss. Okay, you can play around with these settings a bit. I mean, these aren't the perfect settings. I'm not a master of lighting and materials, and I mean, I'm learning this as I go along as well. So don't be afraid to play around with these settings and have fun. I'm gonna go back into material view mode. And now I'm going to go into edit mode, hit 1 to go in the front view. And to make the stickers, essentially we are going to be selecting faces and assigning a new material to them. So for each color is going to have its own material. So I'm going to hit the plus button right here, create a new material, and I'll call it red. Let's start off with red. So I'll choose a color that sounds, that looks perfectly fine. If you want, you can add a bit of gloss to the sticker. I guess naturally there would be a little bit of gloss. I'm just going to stick with a diffuse shader for now. Again, this is really kind of aimed at people just learning Blender, so I won't make it too complicated. We can move to the face selection mode. And if you hit B, you get a beautiful little selection tool. Now, this is the part that kind of gets a little tricky. Actually, I'll just kind of zoom in here, zoom with your scroll wheel, and you can pan by holding the shift key and the scroll wheel, or middle mouse button, or however your mouse is set up. Okay, so I'm going to select these faces right here, and by hitting B to get the selection tool, I'm going to pan over. Essentially, I'm going to select the same faces on every single cube. So this is the tedious, boring part. I'll essentially show you the process for one side, and then I'll basically cut to what that looks like all completed, because I don't think you guys want to hear me talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. Okay, so now that we have these faces selected, we have our material right here, we're going to hit assign. So if I deselect, you kind of see right here what this looks like in material mode. We have our stickers, and the plastic material is basically going to be in the little grooves and cracks right here, and in the, I guess, joints, if you will, the edges, the beveled edges. And so if I did a quick little render, you can see right here how that looks. And you can imagine, you know, if you had colored stickers, again, I'm going to be using that term, on each side, ultimately this would resemble very much a Rubik's Cube. So what you can do to kind of speed up the process, let's say you added a bit of gloss to the stickers, what you can just do is hit the plus. If you want to kind of duplicate the material, you can select the original colored material and hit the plus button here. That will essentially create a duplicate of the material. Change the name, let's change it to blue, then change the color, and it should carry over all of the shaders. So if you have a glossy shader in there, that should carry over as well. So I'll hit 3 to go into this view, and essentially rinse and repeat, do the exact same thing. I'm going to cut here because this is relatively straightforward, and we will see each other in just a second. Okay, so I am back. I'm just going to make sure that I'm recording, and yes, I am. Excuse me there. So I've made 3 of the sides. I haven't gone through the trouble of making all the other sides, like, you know, what you see in back here, because the final render is just going to be one kind of photo. It's not going to be an animation. If you do want to learn how to animate a Rubik's Cube, I will be doing that in part 2, which you can click. I'm sure I'll have an annotation up on the screen. You can click that to learn how to animate the Rubik's Cube afterwards, but because we're just taking a picture, I mean, we just need these 3 sides. Unless, however, you modify your backdrop to have some sort of a gloss, then you want to go through the trouble of modeling these other faces as well. Okay, so if I render this out, this is basically what we have. It's looking pretty great. It's just that the lighting is kind of crap right now. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this original lamp. I'm not going to move it. Well, I mean, I might play around, but I don't think I'll need to move it. And I'll set this to, I'm going to have to set this to a pretty high value. Let's set it to 600. Okay, I'm going to hit 7 to go into the top view, because I'm not a master of lighting by any means. Actually, I need to learn a lot about lighting in Blender, in 3D modeling in general, but I do know a bit about filmmaking and photography and the 3-point light system, and so I just duplicated the first lamp using this duplicate button on the side here, dragged it by hitting G, you can drag objects around, and so I just kind of dragged it to what looks to be like the same point if you were to create an axis that went through here at a 45-degree angle. And I'm going to change this value to around 200 because this high intensity lamp is going to be our main light. This is going to be our fill light. And we're also going to create a backlight. So I'm going to duplicate again and then hit G, just kind of put it here. And then I'll bring it down behind the cube. My mouse does not want to cooperate with me today. Okay, that looks pretty good. And we're only going to put the strength to around 50. No need to be super crazy. Let's render that out to see if it looks any better. And that definitely looks a lot better, but the lighting is still not perfect. So I'm going to go into my world settings by hitting the globe right here. Add ambient occlusion, and I think I'm going to add around 0.3. Let's see how that looks. And this is the final result. Thank you very much for watching. I haven't done a tutorial in a very long time, and so I'm pretty rusty, but I appreciate the support and your patience. If you'd like to see part 2, which is how to animate the Rubik's Cube, you can click on the annotation on the screen, and as well I have other annotations to other pieces that I've worked on in the last year and a half. If you're interested in learning more about me and seeing my other projects, I suggest you click on those. And finally, if you like this tutorial, please give it a thumbs up. And if you really liked it, please give me a subscription, or at least please consider it. Thank you very much. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.